So as I said, we're going to talk about leadership this morning. And leadership is one of those things that we talk a lot about, but I really don't think we understand all that well. In fact, I think we understand it so little that most of us fail to realize that we are all leaders in some capacity or another. In his book, Spiritual Leadership, J. Oswald Sanders wrote this. He said, if I were asked to define it being leadership, in one single word, the word would be influence. Now, by that definition, every one of us in this room is a leader. We all have spheres of influence. And to prove that to you, in your folder this morning, you should have gotten another blank sheet of paper. Now, if you've got a pen or need a pen, there should be pens in the basket at the end of each of your row. What I want to do is lead you through an exercise to show you that all of us have influence. And what you're going to end up with is something that looks a little like this. I know you can't read this chicken scratch even if you were real close to it. But each of these circles represents a sphere of influence in my life. You got me here in the middle, and then you've got my relatives, my church family, friends, coworkers, neighbors, and on you could make your circles. And what I want you to do is as you come up with these different circles, write down the number of people in those circles that you have contact with, people that are influenced by you. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do that. Go ahead. This doesn't have to be exact. It's just a tool to help you see that you know more people than you think you do. People you work with, people in your neighborhood, people in your family, people in your extended family. Anybody. You got a minute left. As you finish up, go ahead and add up the numbers in each of your circles and write that number at the top of your page. You still got 40 seconds to do that, but be headed that way. All right, time's up. Now, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm guessing that everybody is at or pretty close to having triple digits. Is that true? When you add everything together? 4? Oh, I thought you meant you only had 4 people. You got 4 digits. Okay, that's good. All right. So I was like, holy cow. There's 25 people in the room. I know you know more than 4. Okay, so think about this for just a second. If there are 25, 26 people in this room, whatever it is, and each of us are approaching 100 people or better, that's a minimum of 2,500 people that we can influence. All right? If leadership is influence, every one of us is a leader. So the question for us becomes, how do we lead well? How do we do better than that even? How do we become godly leaders? So fortunately, these answers can be found in Acts 14, verses 21 through 28, and that's where we're going to be today. So if you've not already turned to the end of Acts 14, go ahead and do that. And while you're doing that, let me catch you up on what happened last week. Last week, Paul and Barnabas were in Lystra, and they healed a guy, and they were worshipped by the people there in Lystra, and that didn't end so well. because Paul was stoned, presumably to death, and dragged outside the city. But miraculously, Paul got up, went back into town, and the next day, Paul and Barnabas went to Derbe. And that's where we are now as we begin reading with verse 21 in Acts 14. After they had evangelized that town being Derbe, and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, to Iconium, and to Antioch, strengthening the disciples by encouraging them to continue in the faith, and by telling them, it is necessary to pass through many troubles on our way into the kingdom of God. When they had appointed elders in every church and prayed with fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. Then they passed through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia. After they spoke the message in Perga, they went down to Attalia. From there they sailed back to Antioch, where they had been entrusted to the grace of God for the work they had now completed. After they arrived and gathered the church together, they reported everything God had done with them, and that he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. And they spent a considerable time with the disciples. So as Paul and Barnabas began to work their way back to Antioch in Syria, they stopped in to visit with each of the churches that they had established on this missionary journey. And in these verses, we're going to find 5 things that Paul and Barnabas did that display godly leadership. And they give us a great example on how to influence folks. The first thing we see that these godly leaders did was that they took care to strengthen the hearts of their people. Take a look at verses 21 and 22. After they had evangelized that town and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, to Iconium, and to Antioch, strengthening the disciples by encouraging them to continue in the faith, and by telling them it is necessary to pass through many troubles on our way into the kingdom of God. In strengthening their people, Paul and Barnabas did 2 things. They encouraged them to continue in the faith, and they told them that it was necessary to pass through many trials on the way to the kingdom of God. Now, I don't know about you, but at first glance, this doesn't make much sense to me. How can anyone be encouraged by being told that trouble is inevitable? How can anybody be persuaded to continue in the faith when suffering is necessary, according to what Paul and Barnabas said? And that was my gut reaction, but the more I studied this, the more I realized that those weren't fair questions. If you look again at verse 22, it says, it is necessary to pass through many troubles on our way into the kingdom of God. This kind of unlocks the whole thing here for me. What Paul and Barnabas were telling these folks is that they needed to keep their eyes on the prize. Paul and Barnabas had faced all kinds of opposition on their missionary journey. I mean, Paul was stoned nearly to death, and they at least faced opposition in every town they were in. But they kept going with their mission. And to many, it probably didn't make much sense. But they kept going anyway because they believed passing through this trouble on the way to the kingdom of God was worth it. It was necessary for them to do that. As far as Paul and Barnabas were concerned, any suffering they may have gone through was going to be worth it. These men led the people they spoke with through the example of their lives and the joy that they faced their suffering with. The joy that they faced their trials was an encouragement to folks. We all know people like this, right? Somebody has something bad go wrong in their life, or some of their circumstances are awful, yet they embrace the situation with the joy of the Lord in their heart. That's an encouragement to me, and I hope it's encouragement to you. That's godly leadership. That raises another question, though, to me anyway. Why is suffering necessary for us to make our way to the kingdom of God? Paul says it like this in Romans 8:16 and 17. The Spirit himself testifies together with our spirit that we are God's children, and if children, also heirs, heirs of God, and co-heirs with Christ, seeing that we suffer with him so that we may also be glorified with him. In other words, we must be willing to suffer as Christ suffered if we're going to share in his glory.